What's going on, guys? Today we're talking about the deadlift, and more specifically, 5 mistakes that beginners usually make. All right, mistake number 1, and I guarantee you've been guilty about this at some point, is shooting the hips up too quickly. So what that ends up looking like is we start to pull and then all of a sudden our hips shoot up and then we finish the lift. Now there's usually 2 different reasons why this might be happening. Most of the time when you are a beginner, it's because your hip starting position is usually a bit too low. So we'll see beginners start with kind of like that squat-like flexion in their knees and they'll be starting too low. So then when they pick it up and they start to initiate that pull where their hips are supposed to be, so at that higher position, they'll lift them to that point and then they'll finish the lift. Another reason why this might be happening, and another reason, or another way to fix it for that matter, is to focus on your pre-lift tension. So the skill of pulling the slack out of the bar entails creating tension through the body, the floor, and the barbell before you physically lift the weight. So when you are setting, you have tension through the bar. So basically, you can hear that I'm pulling up slightly on this barbell, but I'm not physically lifting it. And what this can do for your hip position is that when we get into this position and we create that tension, it can be a bit easier for us to feel where we're supposed to have that weight loaded before we actually initiate the pull. So if you have a problem sitting too low and you don't feel any engagement in your hamstrings and your glutes when it comes to that pre-lift tension, there's a good chance that you're starting a bit too low. So focusing on pre-lift tension can be a great means for fixing hips shooting up too. All right, so mistake number 2, and this one kind of just goes into our pre-lift tension, is not being mindful of how we're pushing the ground away when we start the lift. So a lot of folks tend to forget that the quads are going to be very active at the beginning part of the lift, and by neglecting the actual cueing of pushing them down into the floor, we can lose out on some of the gains. So for a beginner, we usually end up putting so much emphasis into the posterior. So what you're going to do is think about having active feet. So feet that are engaged with the floor, and then once you initiate your pull, push the ground away as you pull. And if you want to take it a step further and really focus on this skill, slow down your concentric to about 2 to 3 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, and that's going to help you be a bit more mindful of what's going on with the legs, because once you're able to conceptualize the idea of pushing and pulling at the same time, your deadlift is going to shoot up. The 3rd mistake that you'll end up seeing is grip and stance widths that don't make sense with one another. And what that basically means is we'll see beginners start really wide and then they'll grip narrow, and you'll have that knee wavering towards the bottom. So you'll end up seeing deadlifts like that, and we'll have the knees going in and out throughout the whole set. Ideally, we want to create some harmonious flow. So when we're pulling, we have the arms serving as hooks so they're not too wide, and the legs are somewhat under the hips. Now I say somewhat under the hips because everybody will have to play with their anatomical differences. So everyone will have different hip structures and you'll all feel what's most comfortable for you. So a good way just to fix this without having to box yourself into that singular hip width stance way of thinking is to, when you are setting, the inside of the arm lightly grazing the leg is usually a really good bet for most stance widths. So if I'm out here, I have a pretty good flow there without much knee wavering. If I'm more narrow, not much knee wavering. Now again, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and you might have to play a little bit with your stance and your grip width, and then obviously you don't want to put yourself so wide or so narrow to where it's uncomfortable for you, but that's an easy way to kind of check in with yourself if you notice that your knees are going in and out of the deadlift. Number 4 is pushing the bar away, and what ends up happening then is we lose our bar path and then we end up pulling ourselves forward. So our bar path is ideally going to come up and down in a relatively straight line. I say relatively because there will always be some slight discrepancies there, and expecting everything to be perfectly straight is once again not a great means for assessing form from a critical standpoint, especially when we account for the individuality of all the different deadlifters out there and how they're built. But what I'm talking about specifically, and what you'll end up seeing in beginners, is something that looks like this. So pull the weight at the top, then end up pushing it down the legs and bending at the knees first before actually initiating the hinge. So what ends up happening here is we push the weight, push, and then look at how far the bar is away from the shin. and then we have to like either do this awkward reset, or we don't even account for that and we pull and the bar is not tight to us, so then we have the hip shoot up and repeating the process of mistake number 1. So one way to mitigate this is, if you realize you're having this issue, start with a lighter weight and focus on your hinge pattern. So as soon as you break at the top here and you start that initial descent, the hips are gonna be hinge, 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 hinge. And then as soon as that barbell hits around the bottom of the quads, you're gonna then initiate the knee flexion portion of the lift. So at the top, hips, 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 hips. And then as that bar, and again, this could vary depending on how long your femurs are and how you like to deadlift, but the top of the quad will usually be your cue to then start the knee flexion point of the position. And a good way to fix that too is to video yourself from the side. All right, the 5th mistake is the most nuanced, and if you've hung with me this long, bear with me, because I think this is a really important lesson that a lot of beginners should conceptualize early on in their lifting career versus understanding it later. And a lot of beginners, like myself even, have fallen victim to this kind of mindset. And what I'm talking about specifically is adapting this idea that the back is going to be perfectly straight throughout the full deadlift, and any degree of flexion is naturally bad or a red flag. Let's pull back the curtains a little bit and look at it from like a more macro scale, right? So the spine has some natural curvature throughout it, and it is designed to flex and extend. So what ends up happening is we hear coaches say, oh, maintain a rigid, perfectly neutral back, but what actually is neutral? Neutral has a range to it. So the idea that the neutral is just one thing, let's kick that to the curb, because neutral has a range. Essentially what I'm trying to get across is to not be reckless with your flexions and deadlift like an asshole, but expect some natural flexion to happen in the back. So as a beginner, this doesn't mean get reckless with your form. Obviously, always be mindful, video yourself, look for little nuances in your form and look for discrepancies in how you can fix them. Context matters here. All right guys, that wraps up the 5 beginner deadlift mistakes. Now obviously, there are more mistakes than what's listed in this video, but I tried to include mistakes and fixes that aren't necessarily always talked about. So hopefully these all make sense, but obviously if they didn't, drop a comment down below and I will definitely get back to you and answer you in depth depending on what you need help with. And as always guys, drop a like, drop a subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.